Hazard Communication Standard is now aligned with the globally harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, or GHS. This update to the Hazard Communication Standard will provide a common and coherent approach to classifying chemicals and communicating hazard information on labels and safety data sheets. Once implemented, the revised standard will improve the quality and consistency of hazard information in the workplace, making it safer for workers by providing easily understandable information on appropriate handling and safe use of hazardous chemicals. This update will also help reduce trade barriers and result in productivity improvements for American businesses that regularly handle, store, and use hazardous chemicals, while providing cost saving for American businesses that periodically update safety data sheets and labels for chemicals covered under the Hazard Communication Standard. In order to ensure chemical safety in the workplace, information about the identities and hazards of the chemicals must be available and understandable to workers. OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard, HCS, requires the development and dissemination of such information. Chemical manufacturers and importers are required to evaluate the hazards of the chemicals they produce or import and prepare labels and safety data sheets to convey the hazard information to their own downstream customers. All employers with hazardous chemicals in their workplaces must have labels and safety data sheets for their exposed workers and train them to handle the chemicals appropriately. Hazard classification provides specific criteria for classification of health and physical hazards, as well as classification of mixtures. Labels. Chemical manufacturers and importers will be required to provide a label that includes a harmonized signal word, pictogram, and hazard statement for each hazard class and category. Precautionary statements must also be provided. Safety data sheets. Safety data sheets will now have a specified 16-section format. Information and training. Employers are required to train workers by December 1, 2013 on the new label elements and safety data sheets format to facilitate recognition and understanding. The term Right to Know explains the purpose of the Hazard Communication Program. This right to know information is about chemicals, how they can harm you, and what you should do to keep workers from experiencing injuries and illnesses related to chemicals and hazardous materials. It's an organizational responsibility, but as with every safety program, each person has an individual responsibility to follow your organization's policies and procedures and thinking about safety on every task that is performed. Physical hazards. Certain chemicals, due to their physical properties, exhibit physical hazards, including flammability, reactivity, and other properties. Physical hazard chemicals fall in the following classes: flammable liquids, or solids, combustible liquids, explosives, organic peroxide, oxidizers, pyrophoric materials. These are materials that may ignite spontaneously in air at temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Health hazard chemicals are those that may cause acute or chronic health effects after exposure. It can be an obvious effect, such as immediate death from inhaling a deadly chemical. A health hazard may not necessarily cause immediate or obvious harm to you or even make you sick. In fact, you may not see, feel, or smell the danger. An acute health effect usually occurs rapidly following a brief exposure. A chronic health effect is long, continuous, and follows repeated long-term exposure. As an example of what kinds of chemicals cause health hazards, the list includes carcinogens or cancer-causing chemicals. An example could be formaldehyde or benzene. Toxic agents could include lawn or garden insecticides. Irritants may include chemicals such as ammonia or bleach. Corrosives are caustic sodas or battery acid. That's not the entire list, but it provides an idea of different types and kinds of chemicals. If you're experienced, you should know quite a bit about MSDS, or Material Safety Data Sheets. MSDSs are factual information sheets that relate to chemicals. The manufacturer is required to provide the required information, and each employer is required to maintain these MSDS on file. Anyone who uses the chemical may then ask to see the MSDS to determine information that may not be provided on the labels. The employer may have all the MSDS information on an electronic database. The primary requirement is the MSDS must be readily accessible. If the company uses computers, a printer should be available to provide employees with a hard copy from which to read the information, particularly in a medical or emergency situation. Transmission of the MSDS information orally by telephone is not acceptable. To be realistic, the information on the MSDS is technical in nature, which may or may not be useful to users of the chemicals. Much of the MSDS information is used by engineers, safety managers, and others to determine the actual hazard of the chemical and develop policies and procedures for the safe use, handling, storing, and disposing of the chemical. The MSDS also provides information on what type of personal protective equipment is necessary and first aid procedures to take in case of exposure. When training employees in MSDS, it is not sufficient just to have them read the information on the MSDS. Training must be provided, and it must be delivered in the language spoken by the employee. Documentation of the employee understanding the training is also required. Some organizations have trade secrets, so they don't want too much chemical information exposed on MSDS. Even if a chemical is claimed trade secret, the following minimum information is required on the MSDS. The PEL, or permissible exposure limit, and the TLV, or the threshold limit value, or other designated limits must be listed. The major difference between material safety data sheets and the new safety data sheets is the SDS, or safety data sheets, have a 16-section format. The information will be more standardized as well. Containers of hazardous chemicals must be labeled in English. Generally, where there are non-English speaking personnel, the label should be in that language or languages also. Labels must contain the following information: identity of the hazardous chemical, appropriate hazard warning, name and address of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. You may use signs, placards, symbols, batch tickets, or printed operating procedures in place of labels on individual containers, as long as the meaning is fully understood by the people using the chemicals. Where the chemical is intended only for the use of the employee making the chemical transfer, labels may not be required. This means the container must be used only by that person and must be used only during the work shift. If the container is to be used on another shift or by another person, then a label is required. Some common labeling terms include combustible, flammable, corrosive, irritating, and toxic. There are several systems and standards for labeling chemicals, but there is not a uniformly accepted system to date. Each system and standard has advantages and limitations. The NFPA Diamond is used primarily by emergency response personnel and does not adequately signal occupational hazards. The NFPA system is good for alerting personnel and the degree of hazard of the chemical and is helpful in drawing attention to storage needs and emergency equipment requirements. The DOT, or Department of Transportation labeling system, uses a color-coded diamond where there is a symbol and term describing the major hazard of the material. The DOT system is used for the transportation of hazardous materials. HMIS, or Hazardous Material Information System, is one of the most popular systems for labeling containers. It uses standard labels to communicate hazards through the use of colors, numbers, and letters of the alphabet and symbols. The new labeling system under the GHS program will have distinctive labels and pictograms to help you identify the chemical's hazards. For as long as the Hazcom standard has been in existence, there is still some doubt or misunderstanding of what training, documentation, and information is required for the Hazard Communications Program. First, employees must be trained at the time of their initial employment or assignment and whatever new hazard is introduced into the workplace. Employees should be trained and made aware of what is required by the Hazcom standard, such as labels, MSDS or SDS, the written program, potential hazards, and other general information. One thing that should be taught and fully understood to employees is that mixing chemicals without proper training and authorization is very hazardous. If you get the wrong mix of chemicals, you could be changing the physical or health characteristics. You could take two chemicals that when used individually, they are relatively safe. However, when you mix the two together, you could form a very dangerous or hazardous mixture. Don't mix chemicals unless you've been trained and authorized by your employer. Employees must be informed of any operations in the work area where hazardous chemicals are present. Employees must be informed of the location and availability of the company's written program. Employees must know the location and availability of the MSDS files. The training should include the observations methods used to detect the presence or release of hazardous chemicals in the workplace. What we mean by observation methods is whether there are testing methods, air sampling, or other methods. How do you know if hazardous chemicals are present or if the air is safe to breathe? Employees must be trained in the physical and health hazards of chemicals. Employees exposed to health hazards must be apprised of both changes in body functions and the signs and symptoms that may occur to signal those changes. It is not necessary that the employer provide training on each specific chemical. Training may be conducted by categories of hazard, such as carcinogens, sensitizers, that is or may be encountered by the employee during the course of his or her duties. In the case of temporary employees, the host employer has the responsibility with the temporary agency. A frequently overlooked portion of the training provisions is dealing with emergency procedures. If a chemical were very hazardous, more information would be expected to be provided on the MSDS and emergency procedures. Training should include measures of protection, what actions should employees take to control the emergency or not control the emergency, and related information. In situations where employees are expected to moderate or control the impact of the emergency, then additional emergency responder training would be required. Shipping and receiving chemicals and hazardous materials may be the job of only the shippers and receivers, but it's important for all personnel who use or work with chemicals to understand the process. When receiving chemicals, proper paperwork, such as the bill of lading and other identifying information, must accompany the chemical. The chemical must be properly labeled. An SDS must be provided for each chemical received. Without proper paperwork, documentation, labeling, and SDS, the chemical should not be received until such time as it is provided. The same basically applies to a person who uses the chemical. Is it properly labeled? Do you know where the SDS is located? Are you familiar with this chemical, and if not, where do you go for proper training and assistance? Receiving a chemical is more than just a warehouse receiver unloading it from a truck. Proper procedures apply to everyone. If you're shipping hazardous materials, you really must be properly trained. The U.S. Postal Service does not allow hazardous materials to be transported. UPS and FedEx have special programs, but you have to contact them for the specific shipment rules. You can ship a can of flammable paint through an authorized trucking company that is allowed to transport hazardous materials. The rules for shipping hazardous materials is found in the Code of Federal Regulations. What all this means is there are specific rules and standards for everything that relate to chemicals. You may not be a shipper or receiver of hazardous materials or chemicals, but the point is chemicals and hazardous materials require your attention. It requires you to read and follow the directions and information printed on the label. It requires you to know and read the material safety data sheet for each chemical you use. If you're not sure about something, be sure and ask your supervisor. Don't take chances when it comes to your health and safety. The Hazcom written plan should have specific rules and procedures on personal protective equipment. The company must have an assessment of all hazards in the workplace. After the hazards have been identified or assessed, proper safeguards should be instituted to reduce these hazards. This protection can come in the form of engineering controls or personal protective equipment. Some chemicals may require the use of rubber gloves, safety glasses, face shields, goggles, rubber aprons, and special footwear or even respirators. Whenever the company requires personal protection, then it's up to the individual to wear it. When PPE is required, it's not a choice. It's mandatory to protect the health of the individual who may be exposed to potential health hazards. For persons who are required to wear personal protective equipment, such as respirators, then specific training must be provided. Personal protective equipment is an integral part of any safety program. Certainly, it would be much better if all hazards could be eliminated through engineering controls, but that's not realistic. PPE is here to stay, and it takes everyone's effort to wear the proper equipment when it's required. A comprehensive inventory of all chemicals in your company is required and must be updated when new chemicals are added and old chemicals are removed. Each day, new chemicals are added to the growing list of chemicals in use throughout the world. New, better, faster-acting, more potent chemicals. Better for greater living. The one thing we must do is keep up with knowledge and information. The Hazard Communication Standard is helping companies all over the world get greater control of chemical information and to develop methods and training programs to make sure chemicals don't become physical or health hazards. The program is working. More written plans are being developed. Better policies and procedures are entering the workplace, and employees are gaining greater knowledge about chemicals through effective training programs. It's a team effort, and it's worldwide. The Hazard Communication Program is spreading all over the world because there's nothing else more important than human life. The new GHS, or Global Harmonizing System, is more standardized in its labeling requirements, and the SDS and its 16-section format will add more information on each chemical. Because this is a transition from MSDS to SDS, you'll continue using the old MSDS, and you may see the new SDS from time to time. Eventually, everything will be smoothly transitioned to the new labels, classifications, and, of course, the safety data sheets. Most of the elements of the Hazard Communication Standard are retained with some updating to the new GHS.